Hi, 8th graders! We are almost ready to start reading The Red Pencil, but I do want to talk to you about free verse poetry before we start reading, and that is because the entire novel is written in free verse poetry. I know Mrs. Butchie has already had a poetry unit with you, so some of this might be review, and some of this might be new to you. So we're going to talk about the characteristics of free verse poetry, and I'm also going to give you some tips for analysis. So when we start to read the book, I'm going to ask you to dig a little bit deeper into the book besides just the surface level. So I'm going to talk to you about how to look at free verse poetry and how to start looking for that deeper meaning under the words. So I'm going to talk about basic poetry terms, and these are terms that would apply to all types of poetry, not just free verse, just so you're aware. So no matter whether you are reading sonnet, haiku, lyrical poetry, concrete poetry, etc., these terms would apply to that type of poetry. So all poetry consists of lines, and that is a word or a group of words written horizontally across the page. And just so you know, a line does not have to contain a complete sentence. So to give you an example of that, I'm going to show you actually the first poem from the Red Pencil. So you can see here that we have 1, 2 lines, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I could keep counting. So you want to count horizontally across the page. It does not, again, have to be a complete sentence. For example, this first one is, finally I am 12. I has a subject, am, it's your verb, linking verb. So you've got a subject, you've got a predicate, this is a complete sentence. But if you jump down, you'll notice that a word like bright is not a complete sentence. This actually is part of the sentence that is split up. Okay, so authors will sometimes split up their sentences, and we'll talk more about why that is too. And sometimes you might have a line that is a fragment, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. So for example, on my new year, that is not a complete sentence. It does not have a verb, so that does not qualify, but there's a period at the end and there's a period before it, so this is a fragment. And so we'll talk about why the authors use fragments here in a second as well. So there are lines. A stanza is a single line, or usually more likely a group of lines that has a space above it and a space below them. So I'm going to show you one line or a group of lines that acts as a stanza, again in the first poem of the book. So here you have 2 lines that you can see they're close together. There's a space above them, there's a space below them, so this would be a stanza. Now you'll notice you also have another 2-line stanza, but here you have a 1-line stanza, and you know that because there's a space above it and a space below it. This one has 2, like the first ones, but this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines in the stanza, so the author may break that up. A line break is the place where an author chooses to end one line and begin a new one. So for example, here the author has chosen to stop this line at the word 12 and begin a new line with the word old. Or just jumping down another example, they've chosen to stop at morning and start with the word bright and stop here again and start with the word as. And again, we're going to talk more about why an author might do that, but those are line breaks. It's where one line ends so that a new one can begin. An end-stop line is a line with some type of punctuation at the end. Now, a lot of times it will be a period, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a comma, it could be an exclamation point, question mark, a dash, colon, semicolon, ellipsis. There are lots of possibilities, but any punctuation that would cause you to stop, pause, maybe take a slight breath, would be considered an end-stop line. And by the way, if you're wondering where this end stop comes from, this is actually a British term. So a lot of times in England, they will call a period, not a period, but an end stop or a full stop. So that's where that comes from. Enjambment is the opposite of an end stop line. So if a line is enjambed, that means that there is no punctuation at the end of the line because the author is signaling to you, the reader, that you should continue reading and not pause for a breath. So to show you examples of those, here this line ends with a period. That would be an end stop line. This one also ends with a period, end stop line. Or a comma, that would be considered an end stop line. But if you jump down to 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth stanza, you will see that after the word morning, there is no punctuation, which means that you should not pause there. You should plug ahead, just plow right forward and go into the next line when you're reading it. So if I were reading out loud this stanza, I wouldn't do this. On this birthday morning, bright as the sun's first yawn, I wouldn't do it that way. Instead, I would continue reading when I got to the word morning. So I would say, on this birthday morning, bright as the sun's first yawn. Notice I didn't take a breath until I got to this comma. That's how the author intends for you to read that, both in your brain, if you're reading it silently, as well as on the page if you were reading it out loud to your classmates. So either way, you shouldn't stop at the word morning, you shouldn't stop at the word bright, you should continue forward and keep reading. Okay, so these again are the basic poetry terms that would apply to all types of poetry, no matter what we read this year. So line, stanza, line break, end stop, line, and enjambment. You'll see those in all types of poetry. What we're going to talk about next are specific characteristics that you will see in free verse. By the way, you might see some of these other characteristics in other types of poems too that we'll talk about later on this year, but you will find all of these things in free verse poetry. So the first thing that you need to know in free verse, the reason why it's called free is because you do have a lot of freedom as a writer or an author when you're writing free verse poetry. So you'll see that there's actually the word no in front of these because they actually give you the freedom to choose what you want to do. So there's no rhyme scheme, which means that there should not be a predictable pattern of rhyming words at the ends of lines. It is okay if a few of the words at the ends of lines in a free verse poem rhyme, but there should not be a pattern or a predictable pattern of rhyme. So you shouldn't be able to see, oh, every other line rhymes. That should not happen in free verse poetry. There shouldn't be a pattern. Also, it's free because you don't have to worry about trying to make words rhyme and trying to make them fit into some sort of schedule or pattern in your poem. So you don't have to worry about that. It's free. There's no pattern of rhythm either. Now, a lot of students confuse rhyme and rhythm, but they are not the same at all. So rhyme has to do with how words sound, like cat and hat rhyme because they have a similar ending sound. But rhythm has nothing to do with that. Rhythm has to do with how many syllables a word has or a line has of poetry. So again, you don't have to worry about this because there is no pattern of rhythm. So there should not be a predictable pattern of syllables and lines of free verse poetry. There is no set amount of lines. So you could have 3 lines in your free verse poem, or you could have 1,003 lines in your free verse poem. It really does not matter. Okay, you could have 1,000,003 lines in your free verse poem. That is up to you as the author. Colloquial language. Okay, I know that word colloquial looks a little scary, but it's actually quite easy. So colloquial language basically just means it's everyday, informal language, like the language that you would use with your friends, with your family, in typical conversations. Now, you might read a free verse poem and say, well, I don't understand this poem. It's got a lot of difficult words. This doesn't sound like how I would talk. And that might be the case because the time period and the setting in which the poem was written may affect how easy or hard it is for you to comprehend. So, for example, The Red Pencil is written in Darfur, or is meant to be set in Darfur. She didn't actually write it while she was in Darfur, but there are going to be vocabulary words in there or customs in there, traditions in there that you are not familiar with, and so that might make it a little bit harder to read than a free verse novel that's set in the United States. Okay? So just be aware of that. Or you might read free verse poetry that is meant to be set during the 1920s or the 1930s. Well, obviously they would have a different vocabulary than we have. And they would think that our free verse poetry was difficult too because our free verse poetry might contain words like internet, okay, or cell phone, and they would have no idea what those things were. So it's all about perspective. So depending on the time period or the setting of the free verse poetry, it may be easier or harder for you to read, but it would still be written in the everyday informal language of that time period or of that setting. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with figurative language or sound devices, and we'll get into some of those later. I'm not going to go through the definitions of all of them right now. But figurative language is language that is meant to create a special effect or feeling. It is not meant to be taken literally. So for example, similes and metaphors. So similes and metaphors are both comparisons. A simile would use like or as to compare two unlike nouns, whereas a metaphor would not use like or as. It would just use a linking verb to compare two unlike nouns. Personification, that is when you are giving human qualities to something that is not human or an inanimate object. Hyperbole is an exaggeration, whereas understatement is not giving something enough credit. Allusion, that is a reference to another literary work within a book. An idiom is a phrase that does not mean the same thing it does in the dictionary. Synecdoche is basically when you're using one word that is meant to represent a whole. And a pun is a play on words that's usually done to evoke different meanings but also create humor. So, sound devices will also be used in free verse poetry, and those are techniques that authors use to stress a certain sound or create a musical effect in their poetry. So, for example, repetition is one. An author might repeat something to stress that sound or to stress an idea. I put asterisks next to rhyme and rhythm because, again, an author of free verse poetry can use those sparingly, but there, again, should not be a pattern of those. So not every line should rhyme, not every line should have a similar rhythm, or a poem should not have a similar rhythm. It should be random, okay, but they can use those in moderation. Just a little bit of rhyme and just a little bit of rhythm are acceptable in free verse poetry. Alliteration is when the beginning consonant sound of two or more words is repeated. Consonants is similar to that, but that's usually a double consonant sound that's repeated, or it's a consonant sound that's repeated in the middle or end of a word, not at the beginning. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound multiple times in close words that are in close proximity. It's similar to alliteration and consonants, it's just a vowel sound instead. And onomatopoeia is a word that imitates a sound. So authors might make use of those different sound devices since they are not focusing on rhyme or focusing on rhythm or a set amount of lines. So they might use those techniques instead. Okay, creative use of line breaks. So in a lot of poetry, you're going to see creative use of line breaks, but you're going to see it more so in free verse poetry. And again, a line break is where the author chooses to stop a line and start a new one. But a lot of times it's not just as simple as like, oh, I just randomly chose to stop this line here and let's just start a new one here with this word. There's a lot of significance behind that. And this is when we start to talk about analyzing the text. So why did the author do that? Why break that line at this point in time and not at a different point in time? So for example, and I'm going to show you some examples of each of these. I'm not going to show you examples of all of these, but they might want to emphasize a word or a phrase, meaning that they want you to pay attention to it because it's significant to the poem, it is relevant to the poem. So for example, I'm going to go back to this poem that I showed you. That's the first poem of Red Pencil. You'll notice here that the word bright is on a line by itself. And that's because the author wants you to pay attention to that word. And that word, I know you haven't read much of the book yet, but does have significance in a couple of ways. So the author wants you to understand that her birthday morning is bright. Okay? And the word bright might not just mean it's sunny outside. It might also mean that it's hopeful, okay? That there are bright possibilities for her future as she gets older. You also see later on in the book that her father often calls her Amira Bright, again kind of suggesting that her life will be bright, her life has bright opportunities. So the author is trying to get you to focus on this word because it doesn't just mean bright like the sun is bright, there's more to it than that. It might be because the author wants to move on to a new idea. Okay, or similarly, maybe they're creating some sort of list. Okay, so they're breaking up those words. So to give you some examples of that again, here, she's telling you that she is 12 and she's old enough to wear a tube. We talked about that vocab word later, or earlier rather, in the week. And then she's moving on to kind of pace the time. So this kind of is a transition to show you, okay, it's morning now, and she's going to kind of take you through her day on this experience. So it might be to change into a new idea. Okay. Or here, it might be to show dialogue. So Muma whispers a birthday wish, and then this is Muma talking, and so that kind of alerts you to that there's a new stanza, there's a new line break here to show you that this is Muma talking, not Amira talking now. The quotation marks also help with that too. Or it might be a situation where the author is creating some sort of list. That's another possibility. So here you have flour, loaves, golden cake. They're breaking these up onto a line each by themselves to make it look a little bit like a list for you, but also help you focus on those different possibilities of what wheat could be used to make. It might be to organize imagery or complex ideas into smaller segments, okay, or even to draw your attention to that figurative language or sound device that is being used. So to go back to the poem again, here you see that this stanza contains figurative language, and we talked about the word bright being on its own line, but she's also put this birthday morning, that's the first part of it, that's your noun, okay, that's being compared to the sun's first yawn, that's another noun. So you have these two unlike nouns being compared with the word as, and she's showing you that visually by breaking that simile up into two parts. Okay, here's the first unlike noun, here's the second unlike noun, and then you need to think about how they're similar. And what they have in common is they're both bright. Her birthday is bright, okay, has bright possibilities, and the sun is bright. So she's showing you what they have in common with that word bright in the center. This also emphasizes that it's using personification too, because the sun can't yawn. That's a human quality. So it's emphasizing the personification by putting it on a separate line from this first part of the simile as well. So there's lots of ways that the author might do that to help you focus on what's important in the simile, help you to pick apart the simile and its significance. It might be to slow the reader's pace, so they pay closer attention is what I meant to say there. So if the words are broken up onto multiple smaller lines, you may think that that quickens your pace, but it actually slows you down because your mind has to stop, move on to the next line, stop, move on to the next line. So the author might want to slow you down so that you're paying closer attention. It might be to build suspense. So by breaking up those lines into smaller ones, you have to keep reading and reading and reading to get to that part where you want to find out what happens. So it might be to build suspense as well. It might be to surprise readers that they break a line, or change the connotation or meaning of words. And I kind of would lump these two together because a lot of times when you get to the end of a line and you think that that's what that line means because your brain wants to stop there, it's hard for us. We want to read left to right and keep going. When the author stops you at the end of the line and then continues that line, they may do that to kind of change your perspective. So just to give you an example, let's say that the reader ends the line with the word baby. Your brain is going to probably first go to a physical baby, like a human baby. But let's say the next line started with the word steps. Well, now that changes your perspective, and that's a little bit of a surprise because now baby steps is quite a different thing than a baby. So it might be to surprise you or change the connotation or meaning of those words. Next, the author might break up the lines to imitate the way people speak or show how they're pausing or when they are phrasing words differently. If you listen to the way people speak in conversation, it's different than the way we might read a book in our head. And so sometimes authors will show you that by breaking up the words. Well, maybe the narrator is pausing here if they were saying it out loud. So maybe we're going to break that line and move on to the next line. These next two, again, don't so much apply to free verse, but they might apply to other types of poetry that have line breaks. So if you are writing a sonnet, which has a strict rhythm and a strict rhyme scheme, you might break your lines at those parts to keep your rhythm, to keep your rhyme scheme. But again, that's not going to apply to free verse. And the last reason that you might break up your lines is to help you create creative use of white space, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide because that's actually a feature of a great deal of free verse poetry as well. So Creative use of white space is the way in which the author spaces out words or phrases on a page. And if you played the Kahoot game I gave you, you might have noticed that white space is basically all the space on the page that is not being used or taken up by imagery or color or words, etc. So for example, if we were just look at this slide, you would see that here I have white space, and here, okay, and in this area, and this area, in between here. So any space that the page is white, it's not written on, it's not drawn on, there's no color blocking or arrows or anything like that, that is what we call white space. So why might the authors play with that space on the page? It might be to emphasize an idea or an important concept. And that's kind of similar to what we talked about with the one poem that I showed you earlier. So to give you an example of that again, here you will see the word into, okay, and that's on a line by itself. So sometimes the author is trying to emphasize that word, and so they might put a word on a line by itself. Okay, or here in this poem, this is actually from a different book called Bluebirds, but the word closer, closer, nearer, those words are important, they're significant to the characters and what they're doing, and so the author might put space around them, so you have a great deal of white space around them, okay, or put them in their own stanza, own line, in order to emphasize that to you. It might indicate to you which character is speaking. So I've seen some authors do this with italicizing words, obviously putting quotes around them, but here's a unique example where this is an excerpt taken from a book called Bluebirds. It's written in verse, and on this side you have Kimmy, and this is what she is saying, and she is on the left, and you have Alice, and this is what she is saying, and her words are on the right. There's no quotation marks used, but you can tell, okay, Kimmy over here, Alice over here, Kimmy over here, Alice over here. So the author goes back and forth and uses this white space to help you see that dialogue. It might be to demonstrate a definition of a word or an event. So in this first poem on this side, which is actually just a few poems into the red pencil, Dizzy Donkey, if you've ever spun around really, really quickly, you've probably gotten very dizzy and you might have stumbled and had a little bit of a hard time walking or maybe even tripped afterwards. And to show that they're stumbling or tripping over each other, you have this, twirling, giggly tipping, and these words are all over the place. They're not back to the left side, and they're just kind of unevenly spaced, and that's meant to demonstrate what it feels like to be dizzy if you've ever felt that way before, which you probably have. So it's demonstrating that. Or authors might put words or phrases into the shape that indicates their definition or suggests to you their definition. So just to give you an example, I took a few words. So if I wanted to indicate how jump looked, I might put the J on a line below and then put the UM on a line above when I'm typing it and P on another line below. So it looks like the word jump is actually jumping. It goes up and then it goes down. Okay. Or if I wanted to use the word hollow, if you've ever seen a hollowed out log before, I might actually make it hollow with this kind of divot taken out in between. Or if I wanted spilled to look like something spilling, I might write the SP here, and then it's falling down, it's spilling on the floor or off the table or something like that, and then it kind of puddles down below. So I might write the word spilled like that. And there are millions, probably billions of options for how you could creatively use white space. These are just a tiny sampling of examples. You're going to see lots of other ways that Andrea Davis Pinkney uses creative use of white space in the red pencil. If you look at any other free verse poetry or other novels that are written in free verse, you will probably find lots of other ways that they use creative use of white space too. It could be by bolding the words, italicizing the words. Some authors have even made their books in color and have put their words in different colors to show significance too. That's another way you can creative use white space, or make their words a bigger font or a smaller font. So if you were writing the word tiny, maybe you would put it in size 8 font, and maybe if you were writing the word large, you would put it in size 20 font. Now those are very basic examples. They're not super creative, but just to give you an idea of how else an author might use creative use of white space. Okay, so obviously this is an Edpuzzle. Make sure you've watched the entire video. Make sure you've watched the whole thing and answered all the questions to the best of your ability. After you've completed this assignment, you will see that later I will be posting the next part, which is where you will actually be starting to read the book. and you will be starting to apply some of these skills that we talked about that have to do with free verse characteristics.